This is our second session in our spring community education series. My name is Denise Vigno, and I'm with Howard Center. So thrilled to have this wonderful panel here with us tonight. In case you don't know, we're a mission-driven organization, and our focus is on mental health, substance use, and developmental services. It just so happens that this month is Mental Health Awareness Month. So just a shout out to that as we all think about taking care of our mental health and think about our family and friends. We're really, really pleased to have this wonderful, esteemed panel with us. My colleagues Beth Holden, Dan Hall, Dr. Heidi Melbestad, Dr. John Brooklyn, and from the University of Vermont Medical Center, Dr. Daniel Wolfson. So really great to have you with us tonight. You'll hear from all of them in just a few minutes. We do want to thank Dealer.com for hosting us once again.
We're having a little trouble hearing.
Okay, let me just put that up a little bit. How's this? Is this a little better? Okay, great. Thanks to Dealer.com for hosting us again this evening. And to make our program more accessible, we want to thank Media Factory. You'll see them all around the room, and they're actually behind this wall as well, making this live stream available for our viewers at home. Our live stream does have captioning, and if anyone needs captioning in our live audience this evening, Paul here in the center, just raise your hand, can set you up with a laptop, so just let him know. Tonight's format is after our panelists make remarks, we'll have time for Q&A, and we'll ask the people here in this room to come right over here to the mic, and then Bridget will also manage any live stream questions from the chat. Let's see, we couldn't produce these events without the help of our supporters, and I want to thank Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, and Hickok and Boardman Insurance Group, the Stotts Brocious Group at Morgan Stanley, the University of Vermont Medical Center, and Velco, Vermont Electric Power Company. So we're really grateful to have them with us. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. One of my colleagues just said the restroom floors are very slick, so if you do need to use the restroom, just please be very careful. It's a good time to put your cell phones on silence. And then just so you know, our arrangement with Dealer.com is we use the usher system, so if you do need to leave early or if you do need to use the restroom, we will help you navigate around this beautiful building. We'd also appreciate your feedback. There are forms in your folder, so if you could leave that at the front desk on your way out, that would be great. And for our live stream audience, we will send a link shortly after we end this evening. And so it's time to turn to our talk. It's my privilege to introduce my colleague and tonight's moderator, Beth Holden. Beth is our Chief Client Services Officer at Howard Center, a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor. She's worked as a clinician, a supervisor, and an administrator in the mental health and substance use fields for over 30 years. And she has a big job now. In her current role, she is responsible for overseeing all of the agency's client services. If you were here early enough, you can see that we touch about 19,000 people annually. It's a lot of people. Beth has considerable specialty training, is an experienced presenter and trainer, and provides workshops on many topics related to trauma-informed practice and mental health. She's also served as an instructor for the UVM Graduate Counseling Program and has served on various boards. Please join me in welcoming Beth Holden. And soon, all of our panelists. One thing, let's just...
Thank you, Denise. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are here for our community education series on substance abuse and our community. Tonight marks a moment in our continued journey towards understanding, compassion, and meaningful action. Before we delve into the topics at hand and learn more from our esteemed panel of providers, it's essential to acknowledge the toll that substance abuse, particularly the opioid crisis, has taken on our community. Each individual affected represents a story, a family, and a community grappling with the impact. Our goal is to engage with you, our community, in an open dialogue that not only educates and informs about existing services, but also fosters empathy and support for those affected by substance abuse. Together, we can reduce stigma, increase awareness, and ultimately save lives. Thank you for joining us on this important journey. My colleagues will be introducing themselves as they go about their talk. And first up, I would like to welcome Dan Hall, who's the director of our outpatient services.
Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Beth, and thank you all for being here. It's great to see everybody, and I know there's a lot of faces via live stream that I can't see, so thank you all as well. I think it really is this kind of community engagement, whether you're here to learn, you're just curious, or you really want to engage in problem solving. It's that community engagement that's really going to help reduce stigma and help fight this issue we're dealing with. So as Beth mentioned, my name is Dan Hall, and I am the Director of Outpatient Services at Howard Center. I've been with the agency since 2007. This has been really my professional career. I started as a clinician doing direct service for mental health and substance use work. I've worked in various roles within the outpatient department, various leadership roles, and now I'm the director. I'm going to talk in a bit about kind of all the services outpatient offers and the programs we offer, but really quick, outpatient services provides therapy services, medication services, Suboxone services, low barrier and harm reduction services, and we serve children's through adults in Franklin and Grand Isle County and Chittenden County. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I think I'll start by highlighting from my perspective what the kind of 5 key issues connected to substance use in the community are. And I'll start with what I think is first and foremost is really the toxicity and the potency of the current drug supply. Fentanyl and xylazine has replaced heroin and prescription drug use and resulted in, unfortunately, unprecedented number of overdoses, overdose fatalities, and just a significant other impacts on the community. So obviously the drug supply and how we as a treatment community approach treatment of these new substances is key. The second piece I want to highlight, I think, is just the increasing and growing complexity and acuity of clinical presentations we're seeing with people with substance use disorders, whether it's co-occurring mental health issues, psychosocial issues like transportation barriers, medical barriers, housing, of course, just the complexity and kind of diversity of challenges continue to just be very acute and very intense and pose a real challenge to the treatment approach. Third, I think, is the growing prevalence of stimulant use disorder as a co-occurring disorder with opioid use. We don't have really a medication like we do have for opioid use disorder, so I think the growing prevalence of this co-occurring issue has also presented some challenges, and how we look at treatment in the community. And then I also wanted to highlight alcohol use. I think because of the cultural acceptance of alcohol use and perhaps being overshadowed by the opioid crisis, alcohol use disorder is still very prevalent in Vermont. In fact, there was a study just recently that showed alcohol top in the nation proportionally for alcohol use disorder. So not for us not to lose sight on the challenges that poses as well. And then I think the last piece I just wanted to highlight before I talk about the services we offer, and hopefully there's a connection there, is kind of the growing visible nature of substance use in the community, whether it's public drug use, whether it's syringe litter, whether it's just uncomfortable behavior that we're witnessing, impairment. These are all pieces that I think have really have become more apparent, specifically in Burlington, and I think it's key that we acknowledge it and we talk about that as a community. So With that overview, I'm gonna talk about what we offer here at Outpatient, understanding that outpatient is just one small part of Howard Center. But the programs under my purview, I'm gonna break them up into a couple different kind of areas. So the medication services that we offer in outpatient, hopefully people are familiar with the hub and spoke model. The hub being the Chittenden Clinic, which Heidi oversees, and the spokes is our outpatient medication programs, also called office-based opioid treatment programs. We have 3 spokes in outpatient, 2 here in Burlington and 1 up in St. Albans. We serve about 800 clients in those spokes, and it's really a kind of a team model approach. There's a prescriber that provides the medication, Suboxone product. There is a nurse for medical needs, and then a clinician to provide the treatment needs. So that is kind of one set of programs, and I'll talk more detail about one of them in a minute. But that's one kind of set of programs within the outpatient department. The other, another set of programs is our kind of therapy-based programs. So this provides primarily individual and group therapy, but there's also case management and access to psychiatry. And this is for all substance use disorders. We typically serve between 300 and 400 clients at a time between Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle County in our therapy-based programs. We're running anywhere between 12 and 15 outpatient groups, and the groups range from, alcohol-specific treatment groups to stimulant use disorder groups to seeking safety and trauma-based groups, and really a whole host of others. We try to match the needs of the groups with current trends and what we're seeing and hearing from the community. We also run an intensive outpatient program that is defined as 9 hours of treatment a week. It's a higher level of care than outpatient, but not a residential level of care. And we have 3 different sections of that across 2 counties. I wanted to talk about our criminal justice program. So for a lot of clients, their first kind of touch point, their first intersection with treatment access is when they somehow become involved in the criminal justice program or the criminal justice system. And so we've worked really hard at developing a lot of relationships with the criminal justice system and embedding clinicians where they intersect. So we have informal and formal partnerships with state and federal probation, and we run 5 different treatment courts. So this is for clients whose crime is really a result of a mental health or substance use disorder. They can enter a treatment court and have access to a full team that includes lawyers, judges, probation officers, clinicians, and case managers. And that team really supports that person through the treatment court process, which typically takes about a year. There's incentives for being in the treatment program or for the court program. And upon successful graduation, usually the charges are dismissed or greatly reduced. So it's a great program and really offers a great opportunity for those involved. Also within our criminal justice programs is the Impaired Driver Rehabilitation Program, IDRP. This is for clients who have an impaired driving offense and would like to reinstate their license. It's a 12 to 15-hour educational course, and sometimes combined with a treatment episode. The last set of programs I want to talk about is our low barrier and harm reduction services. I think we all have, in the treatment community, have learned that really the key to accessing and engaging and retaining clients in treatment is to reduce as many barriers as possible. And Safe Recovery is, I think, kind of the embodiment of that philosophy. Safe Recovery is 45 Clark Street, and it's really 2 programs in one. On the ground floor, we have our syringe exchange program, and that program is a team of case managers that provide clean syringes to the community, Narcan for overdose prevention, fentanyl and xylazine testing strips, wound care kits, vaccine clinics, and then case management to help clients connect to community resources and treatment if needed. On the top floor of Safe Recovery is one of the 3 spokes medication programs that I talked about earlier. And embedding a treatment program with the exchange was very intentional. We wanted the option, the accessibility of a client who might be accessing the exchange for years. When they're ready for treatment, when they are ready to get on Suboxone, it's as easy as walking up the stairs, getting a warm handoff, and accessing the medication treatment that day. The program at Safe Recovery consists of a provider, a nurse, and a clinician, and works with clients really through anything. Also out of Safe Recovery is we have a contingency management program. Contingency management is a evidence-based practice we use it, and it really has become kind of the gold standard for stimulant use disorder treatment. And so we partner with UVMC on this, and clients who are in our opioid program can and have a stimulant use disorder can participate in this. They receive incentives for progress in treatment, engagement, clean drug screens, and can earn over $1,000 throughout the course of this CM, or contingency management program. So I think that's kind of like an overview of outpatient. Again, one small part of Howard Center, but that's an overview, and happy to answer questions when it's time in the Q&A, but I'll pass it on to my colleague Heidi.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
Or Denise, did you have?
No, I just want to make sure all these are on. They are now. Good.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you, and I appreciate your interest this evening. My name is Heidi Melvestad. I am the program director of the Chittenden Clinic, along with my colleague, Dr. John Brooklyn, who's the medical director. We are responsible for the services at the Chittenden Clinic. So the Chittenden Clinic is the designated opioid treatment program here in Chittenden County, and as Dan mentioned, it is the hub for Chittenden County. So that means that we're able to provide both methadone treatment and buprenorphine. You might have heard of it referred to as Suboxone or Subutex. So I'm going to provide just a brief overview of our operations, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Brooklyn, he's arranged a presentation that's going to talk more about the science and the medicine associated with opioid use disorder and treatment. So the Chittenden Clinic is located in South Burlington. It's off of Dorset Street, just down from Trader Joe's and Healthy Living. We have about 1,000 patients that are enrolled at the Chittenden Clinic. And we see anywhere from about 180 to about 240 clients a day to receive their medication. So people come to the Chittenden Clinic because they want to pick up their medication, and then also because we provide an array of behavioral health services. So we have a very large staff. We have over 50 people that are employed at the clinic. We have medical providers, both MDs and NPs. Our clinical staff includes master's level clinicians and therapists that provide individual and group therapy. We also have care coordinators that are responsible for supporting clients in accessing services and coordinating services in the community. For instance, for people that have housing instability, food insecurity, if they have comorbid health issues. So they do a lot to help with wraparound services for clients. We have a really great administrative and security team. We have a large nursing team that dispenses the medication. So our program is regulated by the federal government. We're certified by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So we have a tremendous amount of rules and regulations that we need to follow to provide treatment. I think what's really interesting is that during COVID, a lot of the regulations that we had to follow became much more lax because there was shift in really focusing on public health and reducing the risk of exposure to COVID-19, which meant that we were able to provide people with more medication than previously they might have received. So historically, people didn't receive a lot of medication, which is why you might have heard people come into treatment maybe daily to pick up their medication, or every other day, or even weekly, because there was a large concern about the possibility of diversion and the possibility of this medication ending up in someone's hands, maybe a child or a pet, somebody that's not prescribed. And so during COVID, all of a sudden there was this really wonderful in situ kind of experiment where people got medication much more than they were used to and much more than they had been allowed to receive. And what we learned was that the fear we had about diversion, the fear we had about exposure to medication by non-prescribed individuals was very, very low. So the research has shown that droves of people and children and pets didn't suddenly die because there was extra medication out there. And so we're really focused, as Dan mentioned, on harm reduction. You all know in the community there's been such a large uptick in the impact of opioid use and other substance use on the community. We're really, really focused on how do we reduce barriers to treatment? How do we get more people into our treatment? As you can imagine, being located on Dorset Street presents some barriers sometimes to treatment for folks that don't have transportation. We're really excited. We learned this week, as a matter of fact, Dr. Brooklyn and I, we applied for a grant to receive money to open a dosing site downtown, and we were awarded that. So we are collaborating with CHC, Community Health Centers, at their Safe Harbor site on South Winooski, and also the City of Burlington, the Mayor's Office, Turning Point. So we're going to open a dosing site there, so people will be able to pick up their medication there. We're really focused on internally as well as external changes. Internally, how do we reduce barriers? How do we get people in treatment? How do we keep people in treatment? So we've made a lot of changes over the last couple of years in terms of our intake process, in terms of the services that we're providing, so that we can really support people in their recovery and in their health. So I think I'll stop there, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Brooklyn so he can talk a little bit more about the health and science of the disorder.
Thank you. Anyway, I'm going up there. You can see that.
Let me get you set.
I woke myself up. Hi, everyone. I'm John Brooklyn, and I thought, because I'm a bit of a visual learner, that if I showed you some pictures of what goes on in the brain, it might be more easy to understand what the heck we're doing. Because it is a little complicated, and I think it's helpful to see things. Well, I gotta look way up here. Okay. So, the first thing I think it's really important is that ask yourself, what are you doing here tonight? There are so many other things you could be doing. This is novel, this is new. Hopefully you came thinking you might learn something new, because our brains are hardwired for novelty. Our system is set up for us to get some kind of a reward for what we do. And the chemical that gets released in our brain is dopamine. This probably shouldn't be a surprise for anybody. However, dopamine is really the driving force behind much of what we do: seeking shelter, eating food, having sex, jumping out of airplanes, going skiing, doing drugs, you name it, it's all about dopamine. And so we also have these compulsive activities that people do that release dopamine. So gambling, shopping, soda, burgers, you name it, all those things can also give us a little squirt of dopamine. So when we think about this, there's two parts of the brain that get activated. One is, if you look at the blue area, the back blue bomb is an area where dopamine gets released, and it gets released to the forward blue dot. And when that happens, we feel something, we feel some kind of pleasurable effect from that. And because we feel that, we say, what did I just do? And what do I need to do it again? So it could be something that you purchased, it could be something that you saw, it could be something that you ingested, smoked, whatever, that caused you to get some kind of reinforcement and you felt good. So what happens in humans, and also in animals in many cases, if you keep doing that over and over again, you set up this pathway in your brain called behavior, and you do it often enough, especially when it comes to drugs, we'll talk about that in a minute, your brain gets used to it. And so you become somewhat dependent on the activity. Now, one could argue, I'm dependent on work, I like to go, I go every day, maybe I'm addicted to work. I don't know if that's true, but the fact remains that oftentimes we do things over and over again because we like it. The problem is that we also have this counter activity in the brain, which is called negative reinforcement. So if you do something often enough and then you can't do it, the brain is like, hey, what happened? Why? What's going on here? And you begin to release these counter signals that make you feel poorly enough that you say, I better do it again. So this idea of this back and forth of pleasure, reward, and not getting that is often what drives people to continue to do these things that give them pleasure. So the word addiction, I don't think anybody's mentioned it because we don't use it a lot, because it's not PC anymore. I don't know why, but it's not. So the word is use disorder, compulsive, but in a way, the word addiction still sticks, and it's really compulsive use despite the consequences. So if you're really having difficulty, that's when you kind of get into our world. So with opiate use disorder, and again, it's not opiate addiction, it's use disorder, there's this interplay of all these different signals that happen in the brain that cause people, in many cases, to continue to use opioids because of the changes that occur. So for those of you who don't know, you can see here that in the brain, the gut, and the spinal cord are where we have opioid receptors because we make a chemical called an endorphin, internal opiate. So when we do something pleasurable, oftentimes we release endorphins, which then causes us to release dopamine. So endorphins are critical, meaning that if something is stronger than an endorphin, like an opiate, like a Percocet or some heroin or some fentanyl, it overwhelms the system that we have internally so that we begin to use it. It's very, very potent. It kind of takes over our natural system. And so when people use opioids, they often feel a euphoric effect, a mental effect, but they also get relief from pain because of the receptors in the spinal cord. And they also, in many cases, traditionally, throughout centuries, when opium was used, it was often used to treat disorders of the gastrointestinal tract. So because of where these are located, it kind of points us to some of the things that can happen. So this is just a slide. I'm not even going to read it. It talks about what happens when you use opioids, but I draw your attention to the second one down, which is sedation, and the third one down, which is euphoria. So most people who use opiates experience a euphoria. However, I guarantee that in this room, about 10% of you, if you've ever taken an opiate, you had a negative effect because your brain is wired in such a way that that opiate hit the part of your brain and bounced right off, and it didn't work. So there are people who get zero euphoria from using opioids. They might take them for pain and feel better, but they feel no high, and you're like, what's the big deal? But for other people, the first time they take one of those opioid pills will be the last time they ever don't take them because they felt so euphoric, they liked it so much, they kept doing it, that it's a potentially lifelong affliction. The decreased respiration is why people have an overdose when they use opiates. So if someone takes too much, they don't know the potency, it slows their breathing down, it stops their breathing, and we have drugs to fix that. Dan's going to talk about those in a minute. So this is the lovely plant, which is where we obtain opium from. It's grown in many parts of the world. Typically, the opium that we had been getting in North America was coming from either Colombia or Mexico, but the Indus Valley of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan is where most of the world's opium comes from. And then from opium, for 10,000 years perhaps it was used until 1803. That's all they had. And then morphine was developed by a chemist, and it was 10 times stronger than opium, so it was a big deal. And then codeine after that, and then heroin. Now heroin was actually a cure that the Bayer Corporation developed to cure people who were physically dependent on morphine after the Civil War and the Crimean War. So if you had your arm sawed off or you had bad injuries, you were given morphine for many years, and people became physically dependent on it. So the Bayer Corporation advertised this as a great little monograph. I don't have it, with aspirin, which they developed, and heroin. They actually developed this chemical process for making things a certain way. And anyway, heroin was marketed for medicinal use, and for a while it was pretty effective, and people took it orally, but then some enterprising folks found if they used it with a needle, hypodermic needle, which you could get in the Sears and Roebuck catalog, by the way, back in the 1880s, and injected it, they got quite euphoric because heroin gets into the brain within 10 seconds of being injected. It's very, very easy for it to get in the brain. And so once it gets in the brain, people feel this effect high. They really feel euphoric. Lasts 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and then it begins to wear off. And so through the day, people have to continuously use over and over again until they hit the point where they no longer feel the effect because they've gotten tolerant. And once you get tolerant to opioids, and almost all mammals will get tolerant to opioids, if you don't get them, you suddenly feel sick. And so it's the reversal of the feeling euphoric. Your gut hurts, you have diarrhea, you throw up, your back hurts, you're achy, your eyes dilate, you have a runny nose. There's all these symptoms, and that's what usually drives people to continue to use, not because they're feeling high, but because they're trying to keep from being sick. So all the people that we take care of who have opioid use disorder, we've got them after the green bar, where they've already used for a while, they can't get the same effects, and they're just trying to get through the day. So that is what we call opioid dependence on a chronic basis. Okay, so we went from poppy to morphine to codeine to heroin, and then welcome to the heroin of the 1990s, which is oxycodone, a very popular drug. Vermont was hit pretty hard by the opioid epidemic, so to speak. There was a lot of prescribing of it. And once those opioids went away, once we started to curb our enthusiasm for prescribing opioids, the markets to south of us became interested in providing us with fake pills pressed from fentanyl. Now, fentanyl, which you've all heard, if you look at that penny, the amount of fentanyl, wait a minute, back up for a minute. So when you go to the hospital and you get a dose of fentanyl for a colonoscopy or a surgery, you're getting pharmaceutical fentanyl, controlled 4-step process. When people who are buying what they think is heroin get fentanyl, precursor chemical comes from India or China, it goes to Mexico, somebody gets a pot, they put it on a stove, they throw this precursor in, they throw some baking soda, they start stirring it up, and they get fentanyl. Purity anywhere from 5% to 30%. Nobody knows, okay? And so what happens is that amount of fentanyl, that tiny little bit near the penny, is all that someone needs to take to have a fairly euphoric effect. In fact, it gets pressed into these pills. And if you have never taken opioids before and you're a person who someone says, hey, I've got a pill and it's full of fentanyl, it will kill you. So the problem that we have now in the fentanyl era is that one pill can kill, especially if you're not physically dependent. People who are physically dependent, they can use, but also, as I mentioned, that purity varies so much that one amount that you thought you were using in the past could now be fatal. So we're really up against a major epidemic. In fact, some people pine for the good old days when they could buy heroin, or the good old days where they could sniff or use oxycodone. Those days are gone because the amount of fentanyl that it takes to get into the U.S. is so small that instead of bringing in heroin, you can bring in small amounts of fentanyl. The other thing about fentanyl pills is that the cartels have now made them look like candy or Skittles because they'll color them. And so people can walk into the come into the U.S., not walk into the U.S., can come into the U.S. with bags of what look like candy or pills, and they're really fentanyl pills, and that's often how much of it's getting smuggled in, especially the southern part of the United States, although we're still seeing powders mostly. So we're all up against this. So let's fast forward. So the potency of fentanyl is 100 times the potency of morphine. All right. So that's my story about the fentanyl. And then this. So xylazine. Dan, you mentioned xylazine. Xylazine, and Dan, you're going to talk about it maybe a little bit. Xylazine's an animal, is a sedative that you give to large animals. So if you want to put a horse to sleep to operate on the horse, and you don't want to use a lot of opiates, you give them xylazine. Xylazine is a sedative. It makes the horse go night-night for the surgery, and you give a little bit of opiates to top it off. Why would that be added to opiates? Why would anybody want to add that? Well, when you use fentanyl, you get sedated. It's not an opioid. And the bad side of this from the medical side is that when people use fentanyl intravenously, it causes the blood vessels in the body to constrict to the point where they suddenly get wounds on their skin, independent of where they inject it. So if you've been hearing a lot about xylazine, people overdose from it because it really sedates them and you can't reverse it with Narcan because it's not a opioid, and it also causes significant harm. And I think last year, 2022 and 2023, UVM was just blistered with patients getting admitted. We see a lot of it. We think it's tailing off a little bit. I don't know what you think about this because there's less of it in the supply, but it is a significant added comorbidity that we have to deal with in addition to treating people's opiate dependence. There are people who are actually withdrawing from xylazine, and we have no treatment for that. So it's kind of a double whammy. So, and this is actually a stat from 2022 showing just the increase in the overdose deaths, how many had xylazine. All right, so I'm just going to talk about treatment, and then I'll be done. So treatment. So we know that treating people with opiate use disorder, and I'm a primary care doctor, is probably similar in efficacy as taking care of other chronic diseases. I take care of a lot of people with diabetes, heart disease, asthma, and folks who I take care of who have opiate use disorder, sometimes they're even more compliant than folks who have these other conditions. So what this means is that in terms of taking care of people who have opiate use disorder, it's really in some ways a chronic situation that we as doctors can take care of. You don't need some specialty program necessarily. You can do it. So that, in 2002, that study drove the federal government to allow, because I don't know if you all realize, but until 2002, Vermont had no treatment. We had no chitin clinic, we had no OBOTs, we had nothing. 2002, buprenorphine became available. The feds allowed doctors to prescribe it in their office, which happened to be the same time that the chitin clinic opened, but methadone and buprenorphine came to Vermont at the same time. So the two drugs are different, but the same in many ways. So this just shows you the slide and how it does. So this is my fun slide of how it all works. So we have these receptors in our brain for opioids. We have three drugs. Methadone is a pure opioid, meaning it's like morphine, it's a pure opioid. It fits right in that opioid receptor. Then we have buprenorphine, which is in many ways a safer medicine because if you take too much of a pure opioid, as I mentioned earlier, you get that respiratory suppression, stops your breathing. People can take too much methadone, too much fentanyl, they can actually overdose and die. Buprenorphine has a ceiling effect. It still goes to the receptor, but you can take a lot of it and it doesn't suppress your breathing to the same extent. So in many ways, it's a safer option. However, it's not as, quote, powerful as methadone. So there are people who take buprenorphine, again, we've mentioned the name Suboxone, Subutex, and it's not enough for them. So they then need to get onto methadone because methadone you can keep going up on the dose to treat their dependence. Now, Trexone is a great drug for alcohol use, and it works because you can block, when you drink alcohol, you actually release opiates in your brain. It can block that. In Vermont, I think out of the 10,000 people that are on either methadone or buprenorphine, I think there's like 10 people on naltrexone for opiate use disorder. It's just not anything that is super effective, at least in our population. So we also try not to use the word detox because if this is a chronic condition, you can send somebody to a facility for a period of time. You can put them in jail. You can put them in a space capsule and send them to the moon. But when they come back, they're still going to have a risk of return to use. So we really don't necessarily try to detox people. We try to maintain them on medicine so their brain stabilizes. And it takes about 6 months for your brain to stabilize after your last use. This is just a slide showing that the most effective treatment is MOUD treatment, which is medication for opiate use disorder with buprenorphine or methadone, is the most likely for people to be retained and to be alive a year later when they compare it to things like no treatment or going to just counseling or going to rehab, something of that sort. That's not to negate those things, but the most effective is when you do a medication first and then add the other things on top of it. Okay. So as I mentioned, methadone's a full agonist. A couple things, as Heidi mentioned, highly regulated because methadone can be tricky. The dosing of it can be tricky in the sense that you have to dose somebody on a regular basis and make sure that their dose is stable before you send them out with doses. It can cause people's breathing to go down, and in rare cases, it can affect the heart, but we kind of know how to deal with that. Methadone's the strongest of the 3 opioids. For pain, it usually comes in a pill form, and you can get that prescribed by any doctor in the United States for pain. But for opiate use disorder, you have to go to a specialized clinic, at least in the United States. Other countries, doctors can prescribe it for opiate use disorder. The US, you get it. Typically, it's a liquid. Ours is blue. Other people, it's red. But you go every day, you take a drink. It's about 50 cents for a dose a day. So 50 cents a day, imagine, I think the newspaper's more than that now. The amount of time that it takes people to come to the clinic for 50 cents worth of methadone, you have to think, what are we putting people through in order for them to get their dose? Yes, it has some lethality associated with it, but the cost of the medication is inexpensive. The cost of delivering the service is what makes it expensive. And it can take up to 6 months, as I mentioned, for people to get stable. So when people are using heroin all the time, and this was a heroin slide, and they take methadone, suddenly they feel they're kind of stable. Their brain gets this dose, they feel well, they're not using, and they keep on going ad infinitum. I've met people who've been on methadone for 40 years, but if it's a chronic disease, some people need to be on it that long. And we have people at the Chittenden Clinic who joined us in 2002, who transferred from another clinic, and I think we have somebody who's been 25 years now at our program who's been on methadone. As mentioned, we have problems with, the time the clinic opens. We open early in the morning, we close in the morning, you have to get there. There's some documentation involved, but people stay in treatment longer when they're on methadone compared to buprenorphine. That's kind of a statistic that goes on and on and on. That doesn't mean that buprenorphine is ineffective, it's just that some people need methadone and stay in methadone treatment longer than they do buprenorphine. But again, I have somebody who's been on buprenorphine for 22 years also, so it really depends on the individual. Okay, it comes in different formulations. It comes in these films. You may have seen these littering the city of Burlington because people take it and they throw the wrapper away just like they would throw the Coke can away. So this is what it looks like. There's 4 different strengths. It also comes in a pill. You have to dissolve it under your tongue for 5 full minutes for the medicine to get into your body. You can't swallow it, so it's a process that people have to go through every day. There's now an injection that we can give people monthly, and we do that at the clinic. You do it at the Spokes, where you take a shot of buprenorphine once a month. It lasts 28 days, and then you come and get another one. It's a great option for many people who get tired of taking medicine or were concerned about their ability to keep their doses safe. Here's a slide just showing that when you try to detox somebody off of buprenorphine, you have a 20% mortality rate compared to not. And then the other thing to mention, and I think I'm almost done here, is that because of fentanyl, now all these studies were done with heroin, because of fentanyl, now in people who are using fentanyl, because it's a slightly different opioid, it gets in the brain very quickly, but it builds up in the fat cells of your body and can be there for weeks. When we give people buprenorphine now, if we're starting them, we can often cause what's called precipitated withdrawal. So we put people into withdrawal by mistake. So there are many people who've been in Dan's program who relapse and they can't get back on buprenorphine. So we then have to bring them to the Chittenden Clinic and give them methadone because the methadone won't precipitate withdrawal. So we're seeing a shift in many cases of people who are long-term stable on buprenorphine returning to use. When it was heroin, they could get back on buprenorphine pretty easily, but now that it's fentanyl, they have to go on to methadone. So we're really facing that as a system. And then we've talked about this, naltrexone I mentioned, and that's it.
You're welcome. Can you hear me all right? All right, great. I love going after Dr. Brooklyn because he explains everything. Makes my job a lot easier. So I'm Dan Wolfson. I'm a emergency medicine physician at University of Vermont Medical Center, and I'm the State of Vermont EMS Medical Director. The story I want to tell you is how the emergency department has responded to the opioid epidemic. It's emergency medicine, so we take care of anybody that comes into our department 24/7. That's what we do. And I guess it was about 5 years ago that as the opioid epidemic got worse and worse, that we realized that what we were doing, we'd save your life. You'd come in unresponsive. We'd give naloxone, which is, John didn't talk about that too much, but that's the agent that reverses an opioid overdose because it goes onto those opioid receptors that you saw the pictures of, and it knocks the heroin or the fentanyl or whatever it is off, and gets you breathing again. And we used to feel great that we were giving people in the lock zone, saving their lives, and then we realized we need to do more. We need to actually offer them treatment. So I think it was about, was it 2018 we started?
Before COVID,
Yeah, before COVID. I think it was 2018. We started a program in the emergency department called Start Treatment and Recovery, also known as STAR, where we would, if you came in with an overdose, or even if you just had withdrawal for opioid use disorder, we would right away offer you the buprenorphine or Suboxone. And we'd give you a starter pack to go home with, and you'd get a guaranteed follow-up appointment at the addiction treatment program within 72 hours, generally the next business day. So if you came in on a Thursday, you'd have a guaranteed spot on Friday. If you came in on Friday, you'd guaranteed spot on Monday. And that was going pretty well until that bad character fentanyl came into the drug supply. And as John explained, fentanyl is a whole different beast, right? Because it's so much stronger and it builds up in your body's fat cells and it's sitting on those opioid receptors everywhere. And so all of a sudden we realized that we were having trouble starting some people on buprenorphine because of what Dr. Brooklyn talked about, the precipitated withdrawal. So we'd try to give people buprenorphine, and instead of making them feel better, they would feel worse. So we had to adjust our strategy and pivot, and we have designed a system to start folks on methadone in the emergency department as well. And it sounds great, but we're one of the only medical centers in the nation that is doing this in the emergency department, starting people on methadone. The buprenorphine, I mean, you know, when this all first started, I remember we talked about the idea of starting buprenorphine in the ED, and the initial response was, you can't do that because it's super regulated. But we found a way, or, you know, we got rid of the barriers, and the same thing with methadone. We're like, you can't do that, but we've found a way, and now it's happening. And it's the same idea. You'll get started on methadone. You'll get referred to the Chittenden Clinic the next business day. And if you come in on the weekend, you can come back to the ED for repeat doses on Saturday, Sunday, or a holiday. So our experience with this opioid crisis has just been one of trying to stay one step ahead of it, innovate. Right now, we're working on some new approaches to titrate up the methadone dose more quickly because, again, because of fentanyl, folks are requiring higher and higher doses of methadone to be stable. And the little 30 milligram dose we give in the ED doesn't always seem to cut it. So we're experimenting with ways to titrate that dose up more rapidly. And we're also working with Vermont EMS to have the paramedics who see you in the field after they reverse an overdose be able to start you on buprenorphine right away. You know, do you know that about 30 or 40% of patients that EMS reverses an overdose on in the field refuse transport to the emergency department? So they don't have the opportunity to get started on buprenorphine. So now we're working with EMS, and I know the city of Burlington is working really hard on bringing this program to Burlington. They're doing a fantastic job, and we're trying to get it going. It's happening in Bennington, Vermont, and we're trying to get it going in some other communities as well. So now when you come to the ED, we do a shared decision-making process, and we talk with you about whether buprenorphine or methadone is the best choice for you. Buprenorphine's a lot easier to use. It's safe. It doesn't really have the risk of respiratory depression. And so if we can get you treated with buprenorphine, that's our preference. But some people do need methadone, and now we have both options. So that's kind of the story of the emergency department response. I think we play a pretty important role in the whole community response. All of these different programs here are so important. One good thing about the ER is we're there 24/7, and we're just trying to do our part to help out. So that's all I have for tonight.
Thank you all. I welcome you now to please ask questions. I would invite you to come to our mic. We also have some online questions too, but let's start with our audience first. Come on down. I know, sorry, it's a lot to ask, isn't it?
Okay. Hi. It's a little hi. Sorry. Thank you. Hi, my name is Nora. Thank you so much for presenting tonight. I have so many questions. I'm currently getting my master's at UVM in social work and have such a strong interest in this topic, but I'll only go with one question, and it is, with fentanyl and xylazine, with both being so deadly, I'm just confused about the purpose of the introduction into the supply. I mean, perhaps I'm wrong in my assumption, but I would think you wouldn't want to potentially kill your consumers, you know, just from a money aspect. Not that, you know, that's that great that we're just potentially seeing each other as dollar signs, but what is the purpose? Or like, how did it just come about, if that makes sense?
I have tales from the crypt. Don't know if I should share them all. Well, one thing to remember is that if you, and your point is extremely well taken, if every time you bought a can of tomatoes and someone ate it and they expired, you wouldn't be selling a lot of tomatoes, so why? I don't know what goes into the minds of folks. I will say from what patients have told me that some people really like the added effect of the xylazine because it's very sedating. It makes you feel groggy. It makes you feel sedated. And there are some people, there have been some instances where people have been buying powder that had nothing but xylazine in it. So I think, in fact, we were sharing earlier that there was a patient who had just gotten out of jail. I saw him in October, and he says, he said the two fellows who were selling what they called Philly Blue, which was blue powder, had just been arrested, and a lot of people in the fall time were really succumbing to xylazine overdoses, that he was told by the two people while he was in jail that it was nothing but Miracle Grow and xylazine, and that they were laughing because they couldn't believe how many people would buy it, thinking that it was, as they called it, dope. So I think there's always the novelty seeker, and then there's always the person who's going to try to meet that need. And I think it's probably the combination. And there are many people, when someone overdoses, they want that. They want to try that. They want that because they're seeking that thrill. But your point's extremely well taken. Why?
I don't know if you can, which mic is
Something
it?
to say
This
about
one?
that? Yeah.
Can I
Both,
just add?
okay.
Please do.
Can you hear me
Just
now?
add one thing.
Okay, yes.
So the xylazine, well, first of all, the why, I think it basically is because they're making $1, and that's all they care about. The xylazine is different. It causes profound sedation, and what we noticed in the emergency department is folks would come in And even after we give them the naloxone, they'd start breathing again, but they'd still be unconscious for 6, 8, 12, 18 hours. And so that's the change. And what I've heard from patients who I've spoken to is some of them like the xylazine because it potentiates and extends the effect of using the fentanyl. So remember the chart Dr. Brooklyn showed, the up and down, feeling decent, feeling sick. Well, the xylazine makes it last a whole lot longer. So I think that's why people are sometimes seeking it out.
I was going to also add, because it is so powerful that there's so many people that don't die from it, it expands their market. It doesn't matter how many people are dying. There's that many more people that want it because it is so, I guess the incorrect word now is addictive, but it is. So we certainly see that low-level drug dealers are selling it consistently, and many people survive, and it expands their market. So that's my theory, anyway, behind it. I'm here from Essex. My question is about what I see as a major barrier to viewing this as a health issue as opposed to a criminal one. We're struggling with our police chief in our town to educate the population, to prevent. And I'm wondering if there's any way for you to work with our government, with the state, to set requirements for our police chiefs, our fire chiefs, and our EMS to require them to get educated on what this is and what it's about, because they're still stuck in the whole thing that hasn't worked for 50 years and just keeps getting increasingly worse. So I'm wondering where you guys are at, because I know in Essex we did a lot of work to try to at least get the community outreach program started, which now our police chief embraces, right? Because it works, and it helps you guys because you're not experts in those areas, right? So we want people with expertise doing that kind of work. And how do we expand that into our public safety sector to understand this is a major health issue throughout the state and throughout the world? It's not just in Vermont. I see it everywhere. So we need your help to try to convince the people in charge, who actually take up a third of our budget. So I don't know how to get people to even understand in terms of, I as a mom, to talk out about it. A lot of people don't even want to speak about it because they're too embarrassed to let people know that you knew someone, or you knew someone that died, or you know someone who was actively using. So how do we stop that barrier? I want to eliminate that barrier as much as possible. Just really need your help. Thanks.
I think each of our panelists have a comment about this one. Who would like to start?
I'm happy.
Heidi, thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I think one place that we start is with what you're doing, which is that you are talking about it. And I think historically, communities that are perhaps further along in their sort of understanding, progression, and support of opioid use disorder and treatment started where maybe Essex is, or what you're talking about, right? That we know that initially there has been resistance to opioid treatment programs going into communities. Dr. Brooklyn can talk about what it was like to get the Chittenden Clinic in South Burlington. So, I always encourage people to do what you're doing, to just start talking about it amongst themselves. I think one thing that I love about Vermont is the relationships that we all have, how close we are to our legislators. And so I think, I'd be happy to talk to people if you have a city council, to talk to your police department. We work really closely and continue to build relationships with the Burlington Police Department and the fire department. So I think it's about the collaboration. It's the community approach. And to me, that's where we start, and we sort of help each other along.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. It reminds me of the big push we did to get Narcan, the overdose reversal drug, into the community, and how there was hesitancy for, even police offices to not carry Narcan. But it did. It took like an educational campaign. It took a lot of community education. It took partnering. I always think, showing the research, showing the data to help dispel myths or to help get the point across is always an effective method. So the more that we can engage in those conversations and bring research to back it up is key. And like Heidi said, whatever opportunities, and we already have a lot of intersection and partnerships to build on those to educate and to show what works and to show the research behind it.
What is Essex EMS?
Other questions?
So
Go
just
ahead.
from the, a lot of what you're talking about is the emergency response. So just from a Vermont EMS perspective, we get it. We've had a naloxone leave behind program for many years now. And currently, Vermont EMS is participating in a National Governors Association project to enhance our naloxone leave behind program statewide. So what that means, what does that mean? That if you have an overdose and you don't want to be transported to the ER, the EMS crew, like in your case, Essex Rescue, would give the patient a naloxone rescue kit to keep and show them how to use it, or to a family member. And now we're starting EMS administration of buprenorphine. Bennington is doing it. Burlington is coming on board very soon. They've been working really hard on it. They're very dedicated. And then Brattleboro, Barrytown, and Newport are going to be starting in the fall.
Do you know what Essex philosophy is, the rescue? Or?
I think Essex Rescue is on board with treating, but you know, there is a lot of stigma. There's a lot of stigma, and when I talk to EMS, I sometimes do get questions like, why would we do this? And it's just a constant educational process. For the most part, I think, though, the EMS folks are pretty enlightened, and but we just keep going with education, and I know they all want to do their best to help.
The only thing I might say is, after being in this field for a long time, sometimes the people with the greatest resistance have actually some personal or family experience that is shameful to them, and they push back in the opposite direction. So sometimes you just don't know. But consider that also. Yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael, and I just want to thank you all for your devotion and to all these issues. It's just incredible, the work that you all do. I work with Dr. Wolfson in the emergency department as a recovery coach, and we kind of plug into people after the medical part. And it has been really rewarding to do that for me personally, but it's also, I think, an added help to the nurses and docs in the ED and upstairs as well in the hospital. And I have, Dan mentioned this, and our data, we keep separate data, but the people that we see, it's still 83% alcohol. And we can't forget the detrimental effects of that drug. The other question I have is, Heidi, I've asked you this before, and I think maybe John referred to it, and that is the hours of the Chittenden Clinic. I hear all the time from patients, I can't get there. You know, it's not the bus part, it's the getting up in the morning and getting there that early. Mm-hmm. And I just ask, can you explain that?
So what Michael's referring to, so at the Chittenden Clinic, we are open starting at 6 a.m. and we provide medication until 11 a.m. in the morning, and folks come in to pick up their medication, and then they can also meet with our clinical staff or other support staff. And we're on-site staff, there are staff there through about 5 o'clock. And we historically intakes daily, Monday through Friday, and that you had to be there at 7:30 in the morning. And so what we've tried to do over the last year, and I mentioned this a little earlier, is looking at our intake process and looking at ways that we can reduce the barriers to treatment. So what we've started doing is we created an intake team. We now have an intake coordinator, and we're looking at the time of the walk-in intake process. So we're starting to expand that. Unfortunately, we had a medical provider that had to be out for the last several months, and so we needed to focus on making sure that we could remain, treating the patients that we had. But I think our goal moving forward is to continue to think about how we can increase our intake hours. Can people start to come in later in the morning? Dr. Brooklyn and I are looking at a lot of different ways that we can increase the time. We're also looking at our dosing hours. Can we increase those? I think that one thing that's really exciting about the dosing unit that we got approved for is how do we think about using that site and perhaps complementary hours. So if at the Chittenden Clinic in South Burlington we're open in the morning, could the dosing site in Burlington be open in the afternoon? So I appreciate the comment. I've heard it since I started 3 years ago. I know that we could be doing more. I know that, we could be open at, much more for intake, and we're thinking about it, and we're also having to then balance staffing issues and all of the other logistics involved, but we're getting there. Would you add anything, John?
I just
wanted to, sorry, if you have, I was going to talk about the alcohol use, please, go ahead.
Yeah, just a shout out to Michael and all the peer recovery coaches. I can't tell you what an incredible job they do and how much value they add to the care of the patients in the ED. It's often their interaction with the patients that makes all the difference. So thank you.
I would agree, and I would also, along those lines, give a shout out to Dr. Wolfson and the STAR program. That has been an extraordinary resource for us, certainly with the buprenorphine, but more recently with that methadone access. So what that allows us to do is if someone is calling in the afternoon or they can't get in, there's an issue, we're able to help support them in getting to the UVMMC ED, and they're able to start there. And Dr. Wolfson's team has been fantastic in collaborating with us and helping people get back to the clinic then. So we have this really nice way to bridge to treatment, and that has been very significant over the last year.
I just want to say one thing, though, the mechanics of it, really the deep mechanics, is that if someone is going to start methadone, the requirement is that they have to see a medical provider and be certified within 2 weeks of starting. So if they see someone in the ED and they get started on methadone, or they're seen at Safe Recovery and one of our providers wants them to start on methadone, they've already had that kind of induction so that they can then come to us and just dose. If they have never seen anybody, they have to come and see one of the providers. It's a federal regulation to be inducted onto methadone. So there's this mechanical part of it that's wonky. And because of the STAR program, we're getting more people in. But also, we want people to get relatively stable on their dose before we give them take-homes. In the old days, before COVID, you had to be in treatment for 2 years steady with no drug use to get a 1-month supply of methadone. You had to be there 90 days to get 1 take-home dose a week. Now the regulations are the day you walk in, we can give you 6 take-homes that first day. And if you've been there for a month, we can give you a month's supply. The regulations have completely changed. So to your point, if we get somebody who's started in the ED and they're on methadone and we bring them in and we have their dose go up relatively quickly, we can begin to give them take-homes so they're not beholden and having to come in all the time, because I think that answers that question about, God, I got to get up and I got to go to the clinic. It's 11 o'clock in the morning. So we're really trying to add that take-home piece to people because we're getting them started sooner in different venues. So we hope that helps.
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to just mention regarding alcohol use disorder, because we've talked a lot about medications for opioid use disorder. There are medications for alcohol use disorder. In fact, naltrexone, which Dr. Brooklyn talked about, has some good efficacy behind it. Because of what the drug is, you can actually enter an office-based opioid treatment program and get prescribed naltrexone and have access for alcohol use disorder and have access to that team of nurses and clinicians. So that's something we're trying to do in our outpatient spokes. Is if someone is presenting at the ED or presenting with alcohol use disorder primarily, is we can start them on naltrexone and they can have access to the clinical team and be part of that program. It's something we've just started and we need to do more advertising for, but there are naltrexone and other drugs to treat alcohol use disorder, which hasn't got as much talked about, but there is some good research behind.
Can we give our audience a break for a second?
Yes, all right. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I have a question from an audience member named Bert. Bert asks, what do you think of dispensing methadone at a pharmacy like any other medication?
Oh boy, okay. So, Bert, that is done in many places in the world. And there's actually, I think the legislation is still in Congress, which is, I think Markey is the main sponsor of MOTA. And MOTA is attempting to allow physicians who are addiction certified to do just that, to be able to prescribe methadone and that patients would go to a pharmacy and get it. And I will tell you that there are a lot of big methadone companies in the United States. The Howard Center is somewhat unique in being a nonprofit associated with mental health, but there are entities that have 100 methadone clinics, and there's a lot of resistance because the old tropes about, well, people are going to misuse it, and it really is in many ways a competitive thing. But the point is that if you have so many people dying of opioid overdose, is methadone really that bad an option? And so I don't know what's happening with the legislation, but this seems to be the strongest attempt to try to get that at least in play.
Thank you. Any more audience questions at the moment, or? Okay, I'll just keep going. So this is not a question from the audience, but a question from me. I know, and as you have all spoken about, there's a lot of stigma attached to the people who use substances, particularly with alcoholism, opioid use disorder. I was wondering if you could give us an idea of how people first get introduced to opioids, kind of put like I know you can't talk about anything confidential, but like what are you seeing in the community? What experiences have these people gone through? And what are some of the barriers beyond the chemical effects of addiction? What are some of the barriers to them seeking help, reaching out to the Chittenden Clinic or other hubs and spokes?
So the data show, and it's been replicated in many research articles, that about 70 to 80% of people who are heroin users started with pills, prescription pills. Why? Well, people were either prescribed for a while, and then their doctor decided they'd had enough, and they just stopped them because they thought, oh, they're not going to go through withdrawal. 70% of people who didn't get a prescription got a prescription from family or friends. So there was a lot of access to pills. And when the pills went away, that's not to say, so for some people they would take pills, they would lose their prescription, or they got tolerant and they would move to heroin. But the point is that most people who are opiate users started with prescription opioids. The United States, I think the statistic is still good, 6% of the world's population consumes 40% of the world's opioids. We prescribe a lot. We still prescribe a lot. So the risk is there. And some people argue that the opioid epidemic, the reason so many people are dying of fentanyl in some parts of the country is that pill use is acceptable because it came from a doctor, it came from a pharmacy, and now that fentanyl is being pressed into pills, the risk is super high. You probably all read about teenagers who go to a party and sniff one pill and die. When it was oxycodone, that probably wouldn't happen. So the lethality is now worse because of the sort of societal acceptance that You take a pill when you have pain, but you don't really know what's in the pill. So we've moved from prescription pills to heroin or powders, and now back to, in some cases, pressed or fake pills with devastating consequences. But that's generally the natural history. And the other thing is the pills were fairly expensive. So in the 90s, if you wanted an 80 milligram oxycodone, it would cost you about $120 for a single pill. And if you were a young, enterprising teenager working in a gas station, you weren't going to make that very well. And so next thing you know, there's a bag of white powder with heroin that might be $30, and off you go because it's much less expensive. And now, just for frame of reference, people tell me, so heroin comes in little bags, okay? It's like 100 milligrams of powder. And it used to be about $40 for a bag, and now people are telling me they're buying it for $5. So it's so cheap that the allure of being able to afford $5 or $10 is even that much greater. So whoever asked about the xylazine, the cartels have figured out would just sell it really cheap and in bulk. And so there you have it. It's got to do with price and got to do with availability.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kira. I'm a neuroscience student at UVM, so this is a neurobiological question. Do you have any information about the underlying reason as to why some people develop a dependency more quickly or become more addicted more quickly than other individuals? And do you have any information about genetic research and identifying genetic reasons why people developed addiction more quickly?
I knew someone was going to ask that question. So I mentioned those three kinds of receptors. So each of us has a separate genetic code for each of those different receptors. So your combination of the mu receptor, the delta receptor, and the kappa receptor is different than yours, is different than yours. Everybody's got a slightly different phenotype. So you don't really know. But we know from genetic studies that people who have a high amount of the mu opioid receptor are much more susceptible than not. However, if Dan or I decide to give someone pain medicine for an injury and they take it long enough, they're going to become physically dependent even if they didn't get a lot of euphoria. So when you stop that, someone's going to be sick. So it's not always about the euphoria. We do know that there are people who, because of the way their dopamine receptors are also genetically aligned, there's 5 different kinds of dopamine receptors, that some people have a lack of dopamine. They don't make as much, and so they need to do something to give themselves more dopamine, and so they're more likely to take a substance that's going to increase that level of dopamine so that they feel well. So there's that susceptibility. You have the whole thing about adverse childhood events, right? We can probably talk about that. Trauma, backstory, things that, when I showed you that slide of the negative reinforcement, a lot of people who've had negative experiences, when they take opioids, they feel better. When they use cocaine, when they use alcohol, they feel better. So there's the basis of having had trauma can also be a significant reason why people choose substances and continue to use. But in terms of being able to do a blood test and say, yes, you're susceptible, we're not there yet. Yeah. Thoughts?
I would also add, thinking about epigenetics. So we think a lot about the impact of, in families, intergenerational use, intergenerational trauma, and how that increases risk for individuals. And like John mentioned, adverse childhood experiences, if a parent or a grandparent had that, and then what's going on in the home, and how that also has an impact on neurobiology and genetics and things.
Yeah, just to reiterate both of those points, and the last 2 questions, I think there's the scientific explanation, and then there's the, the environmental components as well. And yes, mental health issues. A lot of people I've talked to, the first time they used any drugs was with a family member, a parent even. And so there are definitely environmental and interpersonal pieces connected to substance use in general, and who becomes addicted and who uses it recreationally is able to put it away. Those play a huge factor.
Tell a story, Bridget, while you're writing. So anybody have any idea of the prevalence of opiate use disorder in Vermont? Like, we're talking about this, but these are just numbers. So we have, the thought is that in the United States, maybe there's about 1 million to 2 million individuals right now that are opioid dependent. And every year there's a study comes out, and I think Dan alluded to it, the National Household Survey of Drug Use. And so they estimate, sort of based on questionnaires, how many people proportionally have problems with opioids. And Vermont is currently listed, I think in the most recent NISDA data, as 1.2% of the adult population 18 to 64 has an opiate use disorder. However, we right now have about 2.5% of the adult population in Vermont is either on methadone or buprenorphine. There is no other state in the United States that's even close to that. So the treatment network, the hub and spoke network that we spoke about, has made access to treatment widespread of the state. The next place in the world with access like that is France, with 3% of its population, and then Iran with 5% of their population. So you are sitting in a state where the access to treatment is profound and varied. Franklin County has about 4.5% of the adult population on either methadone or buprenorphine. And the estimate is that probably in New England, it's probably close to 4 to 4.5% of adults have opioid use disorder. So we have a lot of people in treatment. We don't have everybody in treatment. We have people come into treatment and drop out of treatment, but we have a lot of treatment here. And I think it's because if you look at the historical basis, Vermonters have always loved alcohol and opiates. There was a place in Enosburg Falls called the Spavin Company. And raise your hand if you ever heard of the Spavin Company. In 1870, it was the national leader in exporting morphine and alcohol elixir called the Green Mountain Tonic. And you would take it for anything that ailed you. And it was amazing how much of this, and the plant, the factory is not there anymore, but the building still is. Anyway, we have always had a lot of opiate use and alcohol use, and I think we're still seeing, and I don't know if it's generational or not, but we're still seeing the effects to this day, because there are other places in the US where they don't have as much opiate use, and they don't have as much alcohol use. There's something about something, I don't know what it is, it's in the water, but we have a high prevalence and we have a high treatment rate.
So this question comes in from Zelda. Zelda asks, or says, municipalities in Vermont are receiving opioid settlement funds. How can these funds be best used at the municipal level? And then on another note, do you have any comments on the recent Overdose Prevention Center legislative vote that just got passed by the Senate?
I'll start with the first part, Zelda, about the opioid settlement funds. I think we at Howard Center have been very fortunate to be recipients of some of the opioid settlement money. So some of the money that we have already received is going to outreach. So we have created positions where we are thinking about not just the people that are in treatment, but how do we interface with the people that aren't in treatment yet, but they want to be in treatment, right? Those are the people that we know that we're missing, right? So we are creating outreach positions. We're also using contingency management, as Dan mentioned earlier, as a way to incentivize certain behaviors. So whether that's participating in treatment, in the future, are we going to be incentivizing abstinence or other behaviors to help promote treatment? And then also the initiative that I just mentioned about the dosing-only site, that money is also opioid settlement money.
The second part of that question, you want to read it one more time?
Yes, the second part, any comments on the recent Overdose Prevention Center legislative vote?
I mean, I don't have any specific comments on the vote. I think overdose prevention centers have been a discussion point for a long time, and there's, it's a pretty dichotomous issue. There's lots of folks on those sides. I think if anything we've learned from this crisis is that we need to be flexible, we need to be able to pivot, and we need to have multiple options available to clients during this crisis. And yes, I think overdose prevention centers is one of those options. It's not going to be the answer, but we need a multi-pronged approach to tackle this, and so that is one of the approaches.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Hannah Loeffler. I am here from Middlebury, but I'm also a volunteer with Mercy Connections, which is how I ended up here in this room. And my question for you is, I wonder, just how do you tackle some of this? And just all these questions, because I also have many, many questions, but one question for tonight. Early prevention. How do we stop this from repeating itself? Just not just overdose, but like the whole crisis. We know some of where it came from. We know how some of it happened. How do we keep it from repeating itself in the next generation, in the generation to follow? Are there any initiatives? Have there been any plans? Has there been education that's maybe been successful or not successful in just the early prevention piece of it? How do we keep this from just happening over and over again?
Look at me, I'm the ER.
I'll just say I really appreciate the question, because thinking about this and hearing everyone talk, we talk so much about treatment. Prevention is a huge piece of this, absolutely. Obviously Howard Center, our programming is more focused on the treatment, but prevention is key. And I think, again, I go back to our naloxone, Narcan. Like we really did big push to be out in the schools, and but even that is more like high school, middle school age. But it really does need to start with the family and really early on. And so I really think it's about education to the family unit and supporting programs and partnerships that really get that information there as the primary deliverer of a parent or the guardian. But that's just my thoughts. But I do appreciate the question, because it does feel like we talk so much about treatment. There's a whole side of prevention that really needs to happen also.
I think some of our other challenges are, though we have a pretty comprehensive children's services, where at our organization at Howard Center, we're in all the public schools. We support families wherever they're at, however they need to be met. We have great trauma services for families that need it. Prevention is a really hard thing to pay for, and a lot of the funding we told you about tonight comes for treatment, and Dan was talking about intervention, so getting involved a little further down the path, but I think we're all with you 100%. We want to get to you as young as possible. We want to intervene with families as early as we can, before a drug problem might start, before a mental health problem may explode, before trauma turns into something that turns into a lifelong problem versus an incident that we can help you with. So we're working diligently all the time to try to figure out how can we be more upstream. So thank you very much for your question.
There was an effort by the health department in the mid-aughts, 2015, 2016, to look at prescribing a pain medicine, and they specifically targeted all prescribers in the state of Vermont. So regulations went into effect to reduce the amount of opiates that a doctor or nurse practitioner could prescribe at the initial visit. So all these rules went into place, and the health department has tracked that. There's been a significant reduction in opioids overall in the state being prescribed, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the initial often reason why people end up on opioids to begin with. So I think Department of Health in the mid 2015 recognized that that was a key part of prevention, is that if there are fewer opioids and people understand that if they get prescribed them what the risks are, that in turn reduce the overall amount of prescribing. And some people would argue that with a treatment network as vast as it is, more people are in treatment, but less people are entering because there are fewer opioids to begin with being prescribed. So I think that's been, and I think the health department would say, a big success. The other thing is the thing about the fentanyl pills. I think that in Vermont there's advertising about one pill can kill, like this idea that a pill, what you think might be a Xanax or an Adderall or a Percocet, is actually fentanyl. So I believe that's also out there as a public education effort so that people do understand that you probably don't even want to go there as a preventative strategy.
I'd like to give our speakers one more chance to perhaps deliver a message to you all as our community. If there's one thing you can share with our audience, anything you want to choose?
Well, I was going to mention, the community engagement, the community partnerships. That's going to be key to this challenge. And so, as much as we can continue to do this and form partnerships where clients intersect, I think is a key piece to this.
Yeah, I would echo what Dan's saying. I think when we think about big picture in our social structure, and you asked the question, Hannah, about prevention, if we zoom out even further and you think about why people use substances, and we think about what's going on in our society right now, and you think about social determinants of health, and all the housing instability, all the food insecurity, all of the pain and suffering that many of our community is experiencing, I think one preventative measure is the way that different organizations in our community show up, the way that Mercy Connections supports women that are coming out of incarceration, the way there's so many fantastic organizations in our community that are trying to help people in different ways. And so I think one ask I would have is to continue to reach out to Howard Center and reach out to the clinic and to partner with us. We might not always be able to reach you, but I love hearing from people in the community, and you have a perspective and information to offer us that we really want to hear, and we want to continue to develop relationships to support our community.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. That concludes our evening. We greatly appreciate your interest in this topic and your engagement, so thank you for coming.